Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, it's a pleasure to rise in the legislature today to debate this budget, to be surrounded here today with so many of my friends and colleagues. And, Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid that the hallmark of this government is going to be the phrase, politics is perception. But, Mr. Speaker, this budget is very real to the people of New Brunswick. And with this new budget, the Gallant government is asking people of New Brunswick to pay more and get less. The increase in the HST they are proposing, in fact they're going to force through, will cost the average New Brunswick family hundreds of dollars. And there's been a lot of talk in this legislature and elsewhere about hard choices. But the reality is, this budget, this HST increase, is going to force the average New Brunswick family to make really hard choices. It's not the government, but yet the people of New Brunswick that are going to have the hard choices to make. And those choices are going to be such things as simple as how they're going to feed their children, what they're going to feed them, or whether their kids are going to go to summer camp. These basic choices that real New Brunswickers are going to face because they're going to have less money in their pocket to spend because this government has taken more of it from them. But while they're asking New Brunswickers to make these hard choices, the reality is this government is going to be taking in more money and spending more money than ever before. This government proposes to take in more money and spend more money than any government in the history of New Brunswick. Indeed, we're looking at somewhere in the range of $300 million in spending increases that have been proposed by the Gallant government. And over the next 2 years, mark my words, Mr. Speaker, we're going to witness the most incredible spending spree the province of New Brunswick has ever seen on the federal and the provincial level. And the next 2 years, going into this election, we're going to see spending like crazy. And all this time, Mr. Speaker, it's because Liberal governments believe that they know better how to spend the money of taxpayers than the taxpayers do themselves. This Liberal government, this Gallant government is going to take more money from taxpayers than ever before and spend more money than ever before to get themselves re-elected. Now, the reality is, Mr. Speaker, for a long time, economists have rejected this principle, this idea that the government somehow can take your money, somehow find a way to spend it better than you can, and stimulate the economy with that. In fact, economists have long rejected this principle. And it's not too late, Mr. Speaker. I hold out a lantern of hope to the government. I say this government needs to reverse their direction. It is not too late. Before we pass this budget, they need to reject the idea of increasing the HST, just as they seem to have rejected the idea of shaking down seniors for more money. They need to reject this HST increase. They need to control their spending, they need to manage better, and leave more money in the pockets of New Brunswickers. That's a simple formula, and that is what we suggest over on this side of the House. Now, Mr. Speaker, why is this budget important? Well, it's crucial to New Brunswickers because jobs and the economy are the #1 priority of New Brunswickers. And we've heard those words come out of the lips of the government so many times, but the reality is that the promises they're making, the things that they're doing are not going to deliver jobs or an improved economy to New Brunswickers. And unfortunately, the reality is that New Brunswickers themselves are going to feel the effects of this, and it's going to affect their quality of living. So why is this budget important? Because it has a direct impact on New Brunswickers. It's going to affect their pocketbooks, and it's going to affect their jobs, and it's going to affect their future and their quality of life and the quality of life of their families. This budget is going to have a negative impact on New Brunswickers, Mr. Speaker. Now, I love what we do in here, Mr. Speaker. I'm passionate about what we do in here, and we're privileged to sit here. But the reality is that aside from the few guests that we're allowed to bring into the gallery, there's not a lot of people that pay attention to this. There are a few people that I've asked to watch the debate today, but the reality is there's not a lot of people tuning in. So the question is, what are the decisions that we make in here that percolate down to the average New Brunswicker? And I hope that I'm going to draw some of that out in the course of this debate, Mr. Speaker, because not enough people are paying attention. But the reality is that what we do in here affects the laws we pass and how the people's money gets spent. And not enough people see it. We rely on the media and on direct means to communicate with New Brunswickers because they're not sitting in here and they're probably not watching on television. But, Mr. Speaker, this government is in the midst of two critical errors. And I hope that in the course of my speech that they'll see the wrongness in their ways and they'll reverse their course. These two critical errors, Mr. Speaker, these two logical errors that they're committing are going to unfortunately lead to their government's downfall. The first mistake they're making is that they're saying the right thing, but they're doing something different. And we've had no end of examples of that. The second logical error they're making is that their policies won't work. and New Brunswickers will ultimately feel it, and they will ultimately suffer under the weight of this government and their bad decisions. The reality is that spending like crazy won't be enough to fix the first two problems that they've created. The fact that they're saying the right thing but doing the wrong thing, and that their policies ultimately won't deliver what they're promising to New Brunswickers. Those things can't be fixed by a last-minute federal-provincial spending spree. Mr. Speaker, what I'm seeing here is what I call Jedi mind trick politics. We all know that scene in Star Wars where the Jedi come upon the stormtroopers and they convince the stormtroopers to say, there's nothing to see here, move along. These are not the droids you're looking for. It's a mind trick, Mr. Speaker, but it doesn't work. In reality, it doesn't work. You could say one thing, but when you do another, people ultimately see what it is you're doing. Now, Mr. Speaker, this is not a concept that's unique to Star Wars. In fact, the famous author George Orwell wrote about it in 1984. He called it something different. He called it doublespeak. And doublespeak is where a government says one thing and then does the other. And that was a work of English literature that was prophetic, told us what the future could be, Mr. Speaker, and I'm concerned to see it here in this government. Indeed, a previous Tory Premier used to give out copies of George Orwell's book, Animal Farm, because it speaks to another set of concepts that tend to come out of the Liberal Party, that somehow that the government knows what's best for you better than you do. Now, Mr. Speaker, I want to talk about a few examples of this doublespeak that we've seen coming from the government. The first is, and we were reminded of it just moments ago, was the rule changes. This government, one of the first things they did, they talked a good game about jobs in the economy, one of the first actions they took was to bring to the floor of this legislature significant rule changes. And at the time, their defense was, once again, nothing to see here, move along. But the reality is, these have been substantive changes. And today, we saw the government House Leader come forward and introduce a motion to close down this legislature for the next 5 or 6 weeks. And what that's going to mean, Mr. Speaker, is we won't have the opportunity as the opposition to challenge the government openly in question period. We won't have the opportunity to move forward on opposition days to advance issues that are important to our constituents, to the people that perhaps didn't vote for this government. We won't have that opportunity. So it's a classic example of doublespeak. They said, when they introduced the rule changes, they said, we're not going to close down question period. No, you're going to have lots of question periods. And the reality is, today here, at least 5 weeks of question periods shut down. Let's look at another example of this doublespeak, the Taxpayers Protection Act. Another one of their priorities. Like I say, they talk about jobs in the economy, and their actions are they get into office and immediately repeal the Taxpayers Protection Act. And they said at the time, we won't raise the HST. We're going to do this. We want flexibility in what we can do, but it's not about the HST. And here we are, a year later, HST is getting raised. Mr. Speaker, we could also look at another example, the Financial Accountability and Transparency Act. And the doublespeak there was, they said, in the Financial Accountability and Transparency Act, there was protection. Ministers had to pay a fine if they went over their spending. But the government said, no, we won't spend more. And yet here we look at this budget and there's increased government spending. Another great example of this doublespeak. And finally, the budget itself, Mr. Speaker. The premise of the budget is we're going to tax the citizens of New Brunswick more, but we're going to use that money to balance the books and solve our financial problems. Well, Mr. Speaker, the reality is that they're taxing New Brunswickers more, and in fact, they're increasing the debt, increasing spending, increasing the deficit, to a point that is going to add more burden to New Brunswickers. So in all four of these examples, we've seen this classic, now Jedi mind trick politics. They're saying one thing and they're doing the exact opposite. And they expect that if they keep saying it, the people of New Brunswick will eventually believe them. But the reality is, the more they say it, the less the people of New Brunswick believe them. Now, Mr. Speaker, my job here today is to criticize this budget. Unfortunately, that's a very easy task with this budget. And the reality is that academics, journalists, and people across this province, and indeed around Canada, have already branded this budget as a disaster. This government, like no other government before it, set the conditions for change in the minds of New Brunswickers. They made an excellent case that change was necessary. But the reality is, they've now increased taxing and increased spending. So they created the question in the minds of New Brunswickers that change was necessary, but their solution was to increase taxation and increase spending, which, Mr. Speaker, I consider an epic fail. And the reality is, as I've said, much as this government wants to tell us how great they are, the reality is the people of New Brunswick already know the problems with this budget. And the journalists and the academics and the people out there that are paying attention, they already know the challenges with this budget. Now, Mr. Speaker, there's a famous quote by Abraham Lincoln that I'll paraphrase, and I think we all know it, but it's worth repeating. And it goes to say, you can fool all of the people some of the time, you can fool some of the people all of the time, but the reality is you can't fool all of the people all of the time. And that's, unfortunately, the reality this government is going to be faced with. And that's because, as I've outlined at the beginning, this government is saying one thing, saying the right thing and doing the wrong thing, and the policies they seek to advance are the wrong policies. And unfortunately, by the end of this government's mandate, the people of New Brunswick are going to know all too well the failures of this government. Now, Mr. Speaker, I really enjoyed the speech the other day by my colleague, the member for Bathurst West Beresford. And he outlined the great degree of consultation this government has gone through around the province of New Brunswick to make sure that people are aware of the problem. And I will compliment them on that. They have certainly done that. They have certainly created in the minds of New Brunswickers the question that something needs to change. And I can see my colleague nodding over there, and he recognized that it was the most extensive public consultation probably in the history of New Brunswick. The most in-depth examination of their finances ever, he said. And that in and itself is a problem, but it probably was, I'll give him that. But the reality is that after this great process of engaging with New Brunswickers and asking them for their input, and making New Brunswickers realize that we do indeed have a challenge in this province, the reality is they've squandered that opportunity. They had the opportunity for real change, to do something substantive. But the change they chose was to increase taxation and then increase their spending. And people can see through that, Mr. Speaker. They know because the government set up the problem as a financial crisis. Now, my colleague from Quispam-Sis has already outlined how that financial crisis is, in fact, of this government's making, and I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole with him. I think he's made some excellent points there, and that's on the record. But the reality is they've established in the minds of New Brunswickers that we need to change something, and then they go and squander that opportunity. And the reason they did this great political facade was because, at the end of the day, they wanted to increase the HST. Like many Liberal governments before them, they just want more of the people's money because they believe they can spend it better than the people can. Well, Mr. Speaker, there's a general in Canada who commands our special forces, and I had the privilege to serve under him, Dennis Thompson. And Dennis Thompson once famously said to me, in a context, in fact, it was about a context about relationships in general. We were overseas, we were in Bosnia, and he made the point that you can't keep going back to the well. At a certain point, you wear out your welcome. And this, as I say, this was with reference to relationships and the fact that soldiers deployed overseas often go back to the family well too many times, and they find that if they keep drawing on that, the resources aren't there. But the same is true of the people of New Brunswick, Mr. Speaker. You can't keep going back to the well. The people of this province only have so many financial resources. This province and this country, indeed, is in an economic downturn. That's been well established for almost a decade now. And the answer is never to shake down the people that you're supposed to care about. That is not the answer. You cannot keep going back to the well. Now, Mr. Speaker, any government, this government in particular, has the power to tax. It's an unfortunate reality of the system that the government can basically shake down its citizens whenever it wants for more money. But because you have a power doesn't mean you should use it. Just because you can tax doesn't mean you should. Now, Mr. Speaker, this year we're celebrating 800 years since Magna Carta, a document that was signed in Runnymede in England. And that document's significant. Now, it was a bunch of barons against the king, so it's the foundation of our democracy, but it's a little in a different context. But what was established at Runnymede 800 years ago is controls on the power of the executive. At that time it was King John. The purpose of Runnymede was that the barons, who in that point represented the people, they said to the king, you can't just keep shaking us down for more money. We need representation, and we need limits on your powers to tax. Now, we know about King John through Robin Hood, and I'm going to get into that a little bit later. It's the same King John. But the reality is, the people of England, based on the barons, It's a bit of a stretch, but they were the representatives of the people at that time. They said, you can't keep taxing us, and we need representation. There need to be checks on the power of the executive. And that principle, that 800-year-old principle, runs through the very veins of our democracy, Mr. Speaker. There needs to be limits on the power of the government to tax the people. And just because tax room is created doesn't mean it's a vacuum. When the federal government reduced the HST that had an effect in this province, when they reduced the HST by 2%, Liberal governments looked at that as an opportunity to suck up that tax room, to take that revenue. The purpose of reducing that HST was very simple. In times of economic challenge, it was to put more money back into the pockets of taxpayers. And just because that HST went down 2% doesn't mean that there's somehow tax room or vacuum available. That's money that's in the pockets of New Brunswickers, and it should stay there. Because, Mr. Speaker, right now, New Brunswickers are at the tax breaking point. They're at the breaking point. Government, at one level or another, through taxes, tolls, and fees, takes over half the annual salary of the average New Brunswicker. Over half, Mr. Speaker. The reality is, government doesn't need any more of the people's money. What government needs to do is manage within the ample resources it already has. Half of the salary of the average New Brunswicker goes to government. Government needs to provide the essential services that those New Brunswickers need within that envelope. Government can't keep taxing the people. Government needs to find a way to deliver the necessary services within the vast resources that they already have. They need to manage down costs. And it's not as simple as a one-time solution. Government constantly has to be under that pressure to deliver better services to New Brunswickers at a lower price. Just like every other business out there, Mr. Speaker. Businesses succeed because they're constantly forced to give better service and better value to their customers every single day. And if they can't do that, Mr. Speaker, they have to close their doors because they're unsuccessful. Well, government needs to be under the same pressure. But if we let government just raise taxes, tolls, and fees at every juncture, then what pressure is there on government to deliver better? There is none. And the reality is that tax further punishes people. Now, Mr. Speaker, to my very point, one of the things I find interesting about humans and about this government in particular is their words betray them. And I do pay a lot of attention to what's said in this House, and often there's clues that are left behind. And I recall last year's budget debate where this government said, right in the budget speech, the Minister of Finance got up and said, and I'll quote, "We will continue to exempt the family home from the assessment of a senior's ability to pay for long-term care, but we will no longer exempt liquid financial assets such as savings or investments." This was clearly written in last year's budget speech, Mr. Speaker. The minister stood up and defended it for months, and then they backpedaled on it. So I looked to find the same kind of nugget in this year's speech, and lo and behold, Mr. Speaker, as I say, the government's own words betray them. And on page 17 of this year's budget speech, I want to quote the Minister of Finance, and he says, most economists agree that raising consumption taxes, like the HST, does less economic harm than raising other taxes. Mr. Speaker, in this government's own budget speech, they're acknowledging that the harm that is done to the economy through taxation. It's incredible. And it's clear. Mr. Speaker, as I said at the beginning, there's no economist out there anymore, no credible economist that suggests that raising taxes until the taxpayers are on the breaking point is a good idea. No economist then couples that with spending government money like crazy on special projects. And no economist couples that with continuing to run up the debt. And no economist then couples that with increasing debt servicing costs. But that's what this government is doing. They're raising taxes, they're increasing government spending, they're increasing the debt, and they're going to increase the debt servicing costs. Mr. Speaker, there is no economist that says that this is good economic policy. I challenge the government to find me one economist that says that. This cocktail is lunacy. And it breaks the laws of economics, Mr. Speaker. Now, economics is not the same science as physics. But, Mr. Speaker, there are fundamental principles of economics that need to be followed. And the problem is when you don't follow them, you do get a result, and it's a negative one. And this cocktail of raising taxes, spending more, running up the debt, and increasing the debt services costs are the very problems this government outlined in its consultation. And the policies that this government has now put in place will lead definitely to an increase in that problem. And that's why I go back to the doublespeak, Mr. Speaker. This government could paint a nice picture, it could say all the right things. And I'll tell you, I'm impressed. They are very good at saying the right thing. They really are. It amazes me. But the reality is they're not doing the right thing, they're doing the wrong thing. And ultimately, smug as they may be, that will catch up with them. Now, Mr. Speaker, we've all seen the media reports that have come out about this budget. It's not pretty. But I do want to draw attention to the editorial in the National Post. And I'll quote, "But returning the HST to the 2006 level will produce, at best, $300 million in revenue, while further depressing economic growth on which those programs ultimately depend." So don't take it from me, Mr. Speaker. Take it from the real economists. The reality is increasing the HST is going to have a negative effect on the economy, and that is not going to be offset by the spending spree this government is going to go on. Indeed, and he's been quoted here in the House before, the Liberal leader of the Liberal Party of Newfoundland has said he's going to roll back the HST because it's a job killer. So the Liberals themselves have identified this as a major problem. And Mr. Speaker, I consulted a young student from New Brunswick who's now studying in Central Canada in his PhD in economics. And he made a number of points today which are running through my speech, but one of them in particular that Mr. Chippen raised is that with the HST there are not just the intended consequences, which is the increased taxation and the burden that places on taxpayers, but there are a number of unintended consequences which are not yet clear to us. So the effect this is going to have on the economy is going to be deep and it's going to be significant. Mr. Speaker, at the end of the day, increasing taxes is a bad idea. It affects people, it affects businesses, and mostly it affects consumer confidence. And if this government is so concerned about perception, it needs to focus again on maintaining the confidence of those consumers. Because what that creates, Mr. Speaker, is a downward spiral. Now, we already have enough challenges in this province with an aging population, with an out-migrating youth, and add to this a financial spiral, Mr. Speaker, it's bad news. So taxation, excuse me. And Mr. Speaker, there's still time. This government could step up to the plate and reverse this ridiculous tax policy. They could reverse this tax increase. They could reverse the other tax increases that they've made. They could listen to learned and studied economists around this province and around this country, and they could reduce taxes and put us back on the right foot. So I offer them that as a sound alternative. Let's go forward with that. Now, Mr. Speaker, as I've said, this government had that long process of consulting New Brunswick, or pretending to consult New Brunswickers, and they outlined a number of broad options. They posited that the options were deep cuts to healthcare and education, or increased taxes, which is a false choice, and I've spoken about that before. But what they didn't do is outline their planned increases in spending. And Mr. Speaker, an evaluation of the budget, just at the cursory level, reveals that of 24 government agencies, 12 of them have increased budgets this year. 12 increased. Add to that the fact that this government has chosen to create 2 new funds, one of which is the Education and New Economy Fund, and the other is the Families Fund. And between these two, just at a cursory glance, we've identified in the order of $50 million of increased spending. And we know, Mr. Speaker, that in this budget there's over $300 million in increased spending. And the reality is that increased spending is offset by the HST increase. So they're bringing in the order of $300 million from the HST increase, but instead of putting that on the debt or paying down the bills, Mr. Speaker, what they've done is they've spent it again. They're bringing that money in the front door and they're pushing it out the back door. But they're not being transparent with New Brunswickers about where that money's going. The reality is that money is going to fund the Liberal priorities, the promises that they've made to get themselves re-elected. And as I've said, unfortunately, in the next 2 years, between the federal and the provincial governments, we're going to see a massive spending spree. We're going to see the Liberals here and the Liberals in Ottawa coupling up with their checkbooks and spending that money around the province in the hopes of getting themselves re-elected in the next 2 years. And it's going to be quite shocking to see, Mr. Speaker. But the reality is all that spending is not going to be enough to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. The reality is that the Liberals have put themselves in this squeeze. Revenue is going down. That's the reality. And the more they tax, the more their government revenue is going to go down. Even though they add to the bottom line that $300 million on the HST increase, the reality is their other revenues are going to be depressed because of the negative impact this is going to have on the spending of New Brunswickers and on the economy. So their current revenue stream is actually going to decrease. And add to that the fact that spending is going up. And not only is the spending going up that's identified in the budget, but also the reality of government is they're under pressure. Any government would be. Inflation on things such as health care greatly exceed the rate of normal inflation. And I know the health care minister would understand that because, in fact, often on medical goods, the inflation rate is up to 10% a year, as opposed to a nominal rate of about between 0 and 2% that the normal citizen faces. So there's some real pressures in healthcare. There's some real pressures in education because things are costing more and more. So this government has put itself in a squeeze. But the reason they're there is because their very taxation measures are hurting their own revenue. And because their spending is hurting their bottom line. What they needed to do was right the ship, to shore up the house, shore up the foundation. They had that opportunity. They conditioned New Brunswickers to believe that that was what was necessary, and yet they didn't carry through on it. But instead what they've done, Mr. Speaker, is created this contingency fund. Now I looked at the Liberal platform from the election, and it's right in there. You give them full credit. They put the contingency fund into the election platform. Contingency funds, by the way, Mr. Speaker, are, I think in every other possible case, done when the government is in surplus and they set some money aside. And that's certainly the way people budget their homes. You know, if you have a little extra money, you put money in your savings account because you don't know when a rainy day is going to come. But never before have I heard of a government borrowing money or a household taking out money in case they're going to need it later. That doesn't make any sense. But the government seems to be able to get away with it. But in the platform, it clearly outlines that there's going to be a contingency fund. And that's of $150 million. And sure enough, in the first year in government, they invoked this $150 million contingency fund. And I argued against it. I still to this day think it's ridiculous, but to be fair, it was in their budget. And yet when we contrast their election promises, very clear, with this year's budget, we see that the contingency fund is no longer $150 million. But yet there's no explanation, well there's no real explanation of the rationale to invoke the contingency fund in the first place. But certainly now, there's no explanation as to why all of a sudden it's decreasing. So if it was necessary last year, and it was necessary in their budget at $150 million, for some reason it's now down to 100 this year, down to 75 the year after, and 50 and 25 the year after that. So what is the ideological basis for this? What is the logical basis that says we needed $150 million last year, we said we were going to have $150 every year, but yet this year we're turning it around? And the reality is, Mr. Speaker, as my colleague, the member for Quispam-Sis, has articulated here before, it's a cover-up. This is a way of managing the budget deficit number that the media reports down to a manageable number, to show that the government can show the people of New Brunswick through a shell game of smoke and mirrors that somehow that deficit is coming down every year. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'll tell you what, the people of New Brunswick are smarter than that, and they're going to see it. Why? Because these measures this government is putting in place, as I said before, commit two logical errors. They're saying the right thing, but they're doing the wrong thing. And the policies they're putting in place are actually going to have a negative impact on the economy. And 2 years from now, New Brunswickers are going to see that. They're going to see it in their pocketbooks. Now, Mr. Speaker, there's all kinds of statistics that can be quoted about how a government is performing. And I think most people, most New Brunswickers get a little lost in those metrics. Certainly I struggle with them. Take job numbers, for example. There's been a lot of discussion about job numbers as a metric of how this government is doing. It's up and down, unemployment rates are up and down, and we all know that unemployment numbers take into account the number of people in the workforce. So if people entirely remove themselves from the workforce, actually your unemployment rate can decrease while your economy is actually worse off.
That's what happened.
And that's what happened in this case.
Exactly.
And Mr. Speaker, this economy in New Brunswick may be small enough that the massive government hires that could be planned by this government, that were executed by the former Liberal government, can fake those job numbers. So those job numbers can be faked. But the reality is, the people will see, the average New Brunswicker is going to see that their income is going down. The average New Brunswicker knows, intuitively, that they're struggling. And they know that after the HST goes up, they're going to be struggling more. They're going to be able to afford less. And that's the reality that this government's going to face. Now, Mr. Speaker, I said earlier I'd talk about the myth of Robin Hood. I spoke about King John and Runnymede and the way that was interdicted by the barons. This is the great story of Robin Hood. You know, Robin Hood is the guy who steals from the rich to give to the poor. And that's kind of the way the Premier has tried to paint himself. A guy who takes from the rich, the top 1%, and redistributes that wealth to the poor. But the reality, Mr. Speaker, is that in the Robin Hood fable, the government isn't Robin Hood. The government is King John. The government is the guy who is taxing the people. The government is King John. He's the guy that's got to be controlled. It's not Robin Hood. And what we found through any number of historical examples, Mr. Speaker, is that the government is a terrible agent of wealth redistribution. And yet this government thinks they can nail it. Where other governments before have failed, this government thinks they can nail it. They found a way to redistribute wealth. And we got this card, Mr. Speaker, we all got it on our desks. It's been in all the papers. It's a piece of propaganda from the government. And this government has found a way to take money out of the pockets of New Brunswickers and then give them back that money or less and claim it's a success. And it is true. Some people will get that check in the mail, Mr. Speaker, and think, oh, that's great, the government's giving me money, that's terrific. And they may not realize that the government already took it from them in the form of the HST. It's a brilliant ploy. It's a brilliant piece of political theater, as this whole card is. But, Mr. Speaker, the people in New Brunswick are going to see through it. And, Mr. Speaker, also in this card is that classic, the false dichotomy that this government wants to paint. The suggestion that the only option on one side is deep cuts to healthcare and education, deep cuts, as we've heard my colleagues articulate, or raising HST and saving everything. And, Mr. Speaker, even that would have been palatable if the money from the HST had gone to balance the books. And in fact, it wouldn't have been palatable, but I could at least see them maybe getting away with that. But the reality is, what they've done is they've created this false dichotomy. Either healthcare and education, or we tax you more, which we all know isn't real. And then they've made the decision to tax everybody more, and they've taken that same $300 million and put it into spending. If that money had gone to reduce the deficit, to pay down the debt, to balance the books, to fix the foundation, as this government advocated for, it might have been acceptable. But the reality is they've chosen to do something else. They're spending it on their own priorities. And you don't have to look that far to find other examples of how this government is operating based on classic Liberal principles. And one of them is this New Brunswick Arts Board. It's a small thing, Mr. Speaker. It's a small thing, very significant to a number of artists in our community, and I have lots of them in my riding. But the reality is that this government believes it's the government that can do things better. And so they've taken an independent arts board, they've dissolved it, and they've brought that under the mantle of government. And why? Well, in fact, I believe we should go in the opposite direction on these things. We should empower these agencies to do what they're set up to do as third-party institutions. It's not the government that can fix all the people's problems, but rather these independent organizations that can add real value. And yet this government is once again broadening the tent, bringing everything under the mantle of government, and that's going to cost us more in the long run. It's just one more example of where this government is headed. The other issue, Mr. Speaker, is the growth or decline of the civil service. And I think it's important that we do work to reduce the size of the civil service over time. I think that's a fundamental principle. But when I was in the military, we looked at what was called effects-based operations. And that is, you start at the end point. Where do you want to get to? And you work backwards from there. And what I've seen with this government is they've picked arbitrary goals. They've picked numbers. We're going to trim the civil service. They're going to trim the civil service by a certain number of bureaucrats. They're going to save this amount of money. What they need to do is focus on the services that are being delivered to New Brunswickers, and say these are the services that we want to deliver. These are the services that we need to deliver. How many civil servants do we need to meet that goal, and work backwards from there? But instead, they're starting with their goal. They're starting with their numbers, and they're working backward. They're not focusing on New Brunswickers. They're not focusing on the services. Rather, they're focusing on some arbitrary number and working to achieve that. And my real concern for this government, Mr. Speaker, is, as I've outlined, there's some absolutely crucial logical flaws that they've made. And these, unfortunately for them, are going to come home to roost. The people of New Brunswickers will ultimately see through their doublespeak. They will see that although they're saying the right thing, they're doing the wrong thing. And ultimately, the policies they put in place will have the opposite effect of what they're saying they're going to do. And, Mr. Speaker, it's what I call the drowning man syndrome. And this is my real concern for the government. And that is that 2 years from now, or well, in the next 2 years, they're going to realize they're in the deep end, they're drowning, and they're just going to start flailing around. And they're going to try and invoke all kinds of issues to save themselves. It's a real concern, Mr. Speaker. As I said before, Abraham Lincoln told us we can't fool all the people all the time. And with this doublespeak that's very thick with this government, the reality is it's not going to work. Because people of New Brunswick will feel it in their pocketbooks. The laws of economics, with increased taxes, increased spending, increased debt, is going to lead us to a weaker economy. And New Brunswickers, unfortunately, are going to feel it. And people will be able to tell. But, Mr. Speaker, it is not too late to change this course. We have an opportunity here. The reason for this debate here is to talk about the issues presented in the budget. And I appeal to my colleagues across the aisle. I say to them, Mr. Speaker, you can change course. It's not too late. We haven't voted. The vote's tomorrow. Stop the HST increase. It is not going to lead us down the right path. You've already increased gas taxes. You've already increased property taxes. You've increased personal income taxes. So this is where you should be drawing the line. Mr. Speaker, I say to my colleagues, the ministers across the aisle, control your spending. That's the key. You don't have a revenue problem, you have a spending problem. So control your spending. Also, manage your resources better. This myth that somehow the government of New Brunswick is resource poor is not true. There's over an $8 billion spend in this government's budget, over $8 billion. The resources are there to do what we need to do. We need to manage within those resources better. And in my fourth suggestion to my colleagues across the aisle is that they finally embrace responsible resource development and embrace the things in our traditional sectors through innovation and resource development that are going to build this economy. Because none of these measures in the budget are going to achieve economic growth. They all are going to have a dampening effect. Even the crazy spending spree that we're about to see is not really going to produce long-term economic growth. Even the potential vast hirings in the civil service that we may see in the last year of this government's mandate is not going to achieve real, lasting economic growth. Those measures, Mr. Speaker, will put a thin veneer of failure on top of an iceberg here of disaster. What we need to do, again, Mr. Speaker, is simple. Stop the HST increase and stop it tomorrow. Control government spending, manage the spending that we have in a better, more efficient way, and embrace economic growth in a real way through responsible resource development and the development of other resources in our province. Mr. Speaker, it's time that this government started paying attention to the laws of economics. They don't all have to be economists, but they have to start listening to economists. Because those laws, Mr. Speaker, those laws will bring you down just as much as the laws of physics will. That apple is going to drop from that tree and it's only going in one direction. When this budget falls, Mr. Speaker, it's falling to the earth. It's a disastrous budget. It's going to have a negative effect on the people of New Brunswick. There's still time to turn it around. There's still time to say no to this budget, to vote against the HST, and say yes to managing resources better, say yes to controlling government spending, and say yes to developing natural resources. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.